You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. With me, as always, is Lord Uther, and joining us today, our recurring host, Dr. Sam Loomis from...
I shot him six times in the heart. He's not human.
Wonderful. Glad to have you joining us today on the Warp Core Podcast, our 37th episode. We are talking two of the genre-defining, fundamental... If I were to recommend Star Trek, the original series, to anybody, you have to watch these type episodes. And, gentlemen, I think our fans, the millions...
And millions.
...of Warp Core Podcast listeners out there have been waiting for us to board our NCC 1701 and fly off into deep space to talk the Squire of Gothos and Arena. Again, two of the most popular Star Trek episodes of all time, introducing a couple of very, very important figures and sparking quite a bit of storyline for future Star Trek shows. I can't wait to talk about these, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that if you are one of the 98% of people watching our channel who are not subscribed, highly recommend here at Pending Rebrand you click that subscribe button, hit the notification button so you stay up to date with all the Warp Core podcasts and other shows and content here on the channel, because you don't want to miss what we're about to go through, and that is, of course, the ever-famous Dr. Sam Loomis, I'll get it right one of these days, backgrounds for Star Trek, the original series. Take it away, the good doctor.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. Thanks to all of you playing at home. And happy Halloween. A little bit early. As we do, Star Trek, the Squire of Gothos will be our first hit in this episode. This episode aired on January 12th, 1967. Last week we crossed the Great Barrier and went from 1966 into 67, those late swinging 60s. And so this is the second half of the first season cycle. Nowadays, you're probably used to streaming shows being only 6, 7, 8 episodes in length per season. But back then, the networks, they needed content, and they needed a lot of it. And it ended up being almost close to 30 episodes. 30! For the first season of Trek. So we are rocketing along towards the first season finale, which will get there in just a few short weeks. So, The Squire of Gothos, January 12th. It was directed by Don McDougall. He was a TV veteran director, as all of our directors have been up to this point. He'd done Rawhide with Clint Eastwood. He'd done The Dukes of Hazzard. Good for Don. But the thing that stood out the most with him is that he directed what we like to call the big three of Star Trek. He directed them all in non-Star Trek projects, albeit, they didn't all work together, but he directed those actors outside of the Federation. So for Leonard Nimoy, he directed him in an episode of The Virginian, Don McDougall did. For William Shatner, he directed him in 2 episodes of Barbary Coast. And he actually had the most work, believe it or not, with DeForest Kelley, who, again, as the Southern Gentleman, was playing a lot of Westerns. So he directed DeForest Kelley in Trackdown, Bonanza, Wanted Dead or Alive. So they had a long working relationship prior to and during the Star Trek years. And as a fun thing, later in life, he got a very young Michael Dorn as Lieutenant Worf. Michael Dorn did an episode of Chips with Ponch and John
right.
cruising Southern California's freeways and byways. So I thought that was fun, that the once and future Worf got to be in a Chips directed by Don McDougall. So that was his claim to fame. The writer is Paul Schneider, who only did 2 episodes of the original series, but pretty good ones. He did this one, The Squire of Gothos, and we just recently saw his work in Balance of Terror, which was a terrific cat and mouse game with the Romulans that we talked about just a couple of weeks ago on the Warp Core. So make sure you go back and check that one out. This episode, and I'm going to let the experienced Trekkies go into the ins and outs of how this all relates to canon and so forth, but we are introduced to the mysterious and mischievous Trelane, played by William Campbell. And my first impression of this character and how he interacted with our stalwart crew, as this is kind of what I was hoping Harry Mudd, you'll remember when we discussed Mudd's women on an earlier episode of the pod, I said I was not quite buying what they were laying down with in terms of how he portrayed his character. He wasn't mischievous enough, or he wasn't impish enough for me, especially given the history of somebody like John Delancey and Q, and even Rainn Wilson's portrayal of Harry Mudd in the Star Trek Discovery first season. But this is kind of in my head. If you said, how would you want Harry Mudd to behave and so forth, it was kind of like Trelane. He was playful. He was at times dangerous. And you always felt like the ground beneath you was shifting when you were dealing with him one-on-one. Now, we've already reached early saturation in this first season with the Enterprise encountering godlike beings who can alter the very fabric of the cosmos just with a snap of their finger, a flick of the wrist, or a blink of an eye. And in fact, this week, coincidentally or not, we have back-to-back episodes with otherworldly beings who can intercede on behalf and do things. In fact, we have 2 episodes in a row where Captain Kirk is just snapped off the bridge unexpectedly.
Yet they scream every time.
Yes. Like, oh my gosh, where did he go? Well, weren't you paying attention last episode? The exact same thing happened to him. It also led to one of my favorite visuals when we catch up with Kirk and Sulu, who have been zapped off the bridge early in this episode. They are frozen in place with some mood lighting, some emerald moonlighting, and all I could think of was a classic Mystery Science Theater riff where they're like, suddenly I'm a refreshing mint flavor. But having Shatner and Takai just like, okay, now don't move. And then Trelane says, oh, fine, and releases them. And then they're all like, what happened? Where did the green light go? All right, so some random notes here to kind of get us started. It seems like the Yeomans, I mean, at least we've come a long way in Strange New Worlds and Next Generation and Voyager and so forth. There's a lot of beverage service in these episodes, and you see the Yeomans, whether it's Rand or Barrows or whomever, just casually serving drinks, and everyone's, Sulu, the helmsman, Kirk, everyone's just got to, sip their favorite cup of joe in the middle of the action. So that led to me. We don't see that as much on Strange New Worlds as we did back then. I believe this is the first time we get a order for warp higher than 1. And in fact, in Arena, which we'll talk about in a little while, they get really fast. But I think this is the first time we break, and they give an order of warp factor 3. So that's, they still didn't have the effects back in 1967 to show the Enterprise going to warp 3, but at least the order was given, and there. Dr. McCoy is armed again, as he gets to lead the landing party. And again, it's just, not necessarily the role that we always see McCoy in. He's always, he's accompanying the landing party, but he doesn't really get to be in charge of it. So that was interesting. And then it was fascinating to me how so many of these episodes, we saw it in Shore Leave, we see it here again, the reliance on medieval times style costuming or decor, like that was some idea of the future. Like it's all King Arthur and it's all Camelot, and it's just interesting that they seemed to, or they just had a lot of props lying around from an Excalibur staging production. Hey, we can use these. It's futuristic. Wink, wink. So
just dumpster diving in the back lot.
Right. But let's talk about Trelane, because he is the reason that this episode has endured for 50 plus years. And obviously, you guys will talk about its inspiration down the canon road and how it all ties in here. But he is a singular character, right? Even if his behavior sort of has the Charlie X kind of feel or so forth. I'm a omnipotent being that can, say or do anything, will anything into existence. He's the most colorful, and he stands out, and he's got personality to spare. And so I ask Ursa and Uther, I think we talked about it off camera maybe before, but how do you guys think he fits into this continuum of these type of beings? Is he your favorite? All I have to do is think it and it comes true, type of character, when we have the Charlie X's and we have these Baylock and all of these others. Talk to me about your Trelane feelings and what kind of feels he gives you.
Well, it's interesting you say spectrum, or continuum, sorry. Certainly he's on the spectrum of godlike characters, I guess if you're talking full-on extended universe Star Trek canon. But he's definitely the hint at the continuum. And I think the reason why there's so much conjecture about Trelane out there is because it definitely seems like an early manifestation of Q. Even though it's not in name, and he's a childlike character, but you get a lot of encounter at Farpoint in this episode. You even get a trial scene where the captain is being held responsible for the actions of humanity, right? You get his interactions with Spock, where he doesn't like Spock because Spock is too logical, too calculated. He's not as fun, and that's very Q. It reminds me of Q and Data, except Data was almost so childlike and innocent in his logic and order that Q could have fun with it. I like Trelane a lot. Trelane is definitely, of the original series, probably my favorite antagonist, just because it does hint so much of the continuum, and I grew up with Next Generation, so Q is, beyond like the Picards and the Worfs and Rikers, beyond the crew, I guess. Probably my favorite character of that series for sure. And definitely, as I've mentioned before on the Warp Core podcast, I was very excited to see Q back. But the best thing about Q is that Q doesn't really end. Don't think so linearly. And this is a cool representation if you want to view it as the continuum. And some folks don't. They just view it as another oddball alien that has these kind of powers. But if you think about a child of Q, which we see in Voyager, they get these powers, but they don't really know what to do with them or how to use them. And they don't have the all-knowing part yet. And that's where Trelane kind of is. Like, Trelane's observing the universe and learning, but is kind of relegated to this planet, almost like a prison in a way, but to essentially mature until he's capable of doing more with his power. And then, of course, the greater continuum has to step in at the end and make things right. I like that personally from a canon standpoint as being like, this is Trelane in his adolescence. It's a little far beyond Q2, as we see in Voyager, but not quite as mature as Q or the other members of the continuum we meet, Next Generation and others. Q is one of those characters that I'd like to see more of in Star Trek. I know John Delancey's cute. Like, there's no getting beyond that, I don't think, but there's definitely more you could do with that continuum of characters for future Star Trek legacy, I think. I think they need to get on that because John Delancey's not getting any younger. But, I mean, we've been set up for such an incredible journey with this continuum of characters, lest we forget that the continuum by canon is responsible for a lot of our favorite things in Star Trek, including God, Star Trek V, thank you, one of the best films of all time. 1, 2, 3, no takebacks. But I think it's just it's foundational for Star Trek because it takes that godlike character and puts him on a new, kind of staging, right? It gives them flaws more so than Charlie X, in terms of how impactful they are, because Charlie X is easily controlled, right? The crew can kind of manipulate him. Kirk can't manipulate Trelane, and that's a first. Like, Kirk loses in this episode. This is Deus Ex Machina. Like, if it wasn't for the rest of the continuum here, if we want to refer to them as such, Kirk and the Enterprise lose this battle. So that's a first for the show. It's really a first for television when the anti-hero wins out. I just think that this particular episode, part of the series, however you want to look at it, becomes the, shall we say, the capstone of the foundation from which all of the rest of Star Trek should or does spring. I think, you get a lot of story elements here and challenges that are presented to the crew that they must later overcome that is echoed throughout everything else they do from here on out. Because there's a lot of abducting of the captain. There's a lot of, putting the Enterprise in crisis, and Kirk is ready to sacrifice himself to save the ship and his crew, but ends up not needing to for one reason or another. Even though he's done it before, this is the first time it really feels real, in a sense of, like, he's losing. He is about to lose. There is no coming back from this. We're about to say goodbye to Kirk. And yet, he manages to get out of it. And this is the last thing I'll say is that this is the only opportunity prior to Star Trek Generations that Kirk could have died, because he is separated from Spock and from McCoy at the end of the episode for a brief time. And this may be where he sort of realizes that this is the only time I really have ever lost. And this is how I'm going to lose in the end. So I think that's food for thought as we consider this against what we've talked about Kirk in those prior movies, knowing his fate may have started here.
Well, Dr. Luminous, first of all, we can see why Kirk is so decorated within Starfleet. I mean, this guy encounters a god every other week and outthinks most of them most of the time.
Those weekly reports must really, Starfleet's like, Jesus, again?
Yes. Which makes me wonder, and maybe one of you guys can answer this, I don't think we've seen this yet in Strange New Worlds where a godlike being we've come across.
No, not yet.
Where they're relying on this trope a lot in TOS. So we'll have to go back and double check, but I don't think they've come across, I'm sorry, in Strange New Worlds, I don't think they've come across like an omnipotent being yet, right?
I think the closest is, the most controversial of the season one, the storybook.
The Guardian.
The episodes where they turn the whole ship. Mbenga's episode with the daughter and
the Nebula.
Good point.
Yeah, I feel like, but you're right. There's not been a personification. There hasn't been like you say, a Trelane as Q.
Right.
I'm going to make your lives interesting. Yeah.
Right. So that was one of my thoughts there. And I do think that it would be nice maybe to do it in a legacy episode where we get some kind of structure to the continuum, because Well, and I wish they would link back to Trelane without a doubt, because I think we all agree it's just like you're saying, right? It's an adolescent version of a Q, and you got the parents are like, "I'm going to take this planet away from you if you keep this up," and right, all that kind of stuff. Um, but it would be nice because I've wondered this too, and I think we discussed it a little bit at one point. But like, where do the time travelers or Wesley, like, where does he fit into all this as well? And I know UrzaMaster, you were kind of thinking that they might be above the Q, or maybe like
check
code.
check and balance kind of system with the Q.
Yeah, so it would be. I would like to see that. Now, here's where I'm going to counter. I'm going to go against what I just said. Then again, I don't know if I want everything linked together like that. Like, does it have to be linked? I don't even know if I'm asking for that. Maybe a hierarchy. I don't know. I don't even know what I'm asking for.
Well, I think we all.
A flowchart.
This is the beauty of Star Trek, right?
Yeah, a flowchart.
Yeah, we want some
Thank you, Dr.
organization,
Luminati.
right? That's the cool part about Star Trek as a whole is like it's playing on our human existence and our human methods of thinking. The brain is always looking for patterns and recognition and trying to establish some sort of logical explanation. Spock, and that's kind of what we want. This is probably why we bring this to Trelane and not accept him as just sort of another creature or being. We want him to be a Q. We want there to be some sort of structure to the Q. And even when you do see, we'll talk about this when we get to the next generation, but when you do see the Q continuum sort of broken out, you sort of realize it's chaos. And that's kind of like unsatisfying in a way, but it's also sort of like that makes sense, right? Because it's non-linear. It's not, it's not easily explained. Like even the prophets in Deep Space Nine, they have a check and a balance. You have the prophets and you have the Pa Wraiths. But they're not quite as powerful as the Q on either side. The Q has some sort of a hierarchical, potency above and beyond them, which is, I mean, true to life, it's kind of awesome either way you slice it. Like, but yeah, I agree. Like, I'd love to see more explanation of the Q and the Travelers, but at the same time, I'm kind of thinking like, do I? Or do I like the mystery?
Right, and I also think, I know you said you would have liked to have seen more of them. I actually like when they hold back, because you can oversaturate it, right? I was because I was been thinking about this a lot, and this probably could be a totally separate pod, but like Marvel has completely oversaturated the superhero genre in movies, in my opinion, and sometimes when there's too much of it, I'll argue that all day with you. That's fine, Dr. Luminous. When sometimes too much is just too much. Like, it's overwhelming. It's, where the mystery's gone from it, right? So it's kind of like what you're saying about Q. Like, that we saw, to me, I think we saw Q just enough that it kept that interest going, made us keep questioning what Q is/was, maybe, because if we're saying that it's non-linear, who knows what time frame we're speaking in either. But do we is there a consensus here that that Q is the most powerful being that we've come across in Star Trek?
I think as far as we know, from an extended canon perspective, I don't think there are any established beings more powerful than Q. Because I think Q is like considered the foundation of existence. Like, they're responsible for Entity Zero, they're responsible for God, they're responsible for virtually everything. The only beings I can think of that haven't met with some sort of a Q explanation are the race that seeded all of the big races in Next Gen. And that's the only that lived like so ever many billion years ago. So that's the only thing I can think of that maybe has some possibility of being greater than Q, but even at that, like, I'm sure the Q would probably still be a trump card there.
The answer to your question is V'ger. That is all powerful. There's no way Q could defeat a cloud. So that's
Especially
V'ger
a big cloud that goes. "Brrr."
Yes. So clearly that's the most powerful entity in the known universe. Some other little things that occurred to me. There's a great moment where one of the red shirts is sitting in the captain's chair, and Kirk and them return to the bridge, and it's just kind of like the unspoken "get out of my seat," just keeping it warm for you, Captain. So that was fun. When they're all trying to figure out how to get out of Trelane's grasp, there's Bones sitting at the table sipping brandy. He's just like, it's here, right? So I'm going to have some. And that later becomes a plot point because of its artificiality and stuff. But I just love the sort of shot of DeForest Kelley just sitting there like, it's free booze. So I'm Uhura, when she gets to play the musical instrument, it sounded like she was auditioning for like a baseball organist, because it was like, it wasn't a piano, it was more of that organ feel, and she's kind of like, and I'm just thinking like she could just do the seventh inning stretch and dun 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 dun, like that. This will probably be the only time that Star Trek intersects with Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, as they had dueling pistols, which are actually referenced as Hamilton dueling pistols by Trelane. So I thought if they break out into song here, then we've got a real, possibility. There were some odd Hanna-Barbera sound effects, and by that, during the struggle scenes and so forth, and I thought that was a little too shore-leavy for me sometimes. Like, hey, let's put in some wacky boing, and things like that. So that the sound designer on this episode probably didn't distinguish themselves. I love that Kirk, even though you could, as a modern viewer, see where it was going, I love that he pieced together that Trelane was being aided mechanically in his illusions by shooting the mirror and blowing that up, which is also interesting in that you don't think of any of Trelane's or those beings needing help, but apparently, in order to keep the asteroid from going there. And I love the brief shot of sending Kirk into the asteroid, clutching at his throat, and there's dry ice smoke everywhere, and then back. It was kind of like sending Christopher Pike to hell briefly in the cage. They play dodgeball with a planet. That's something you don't see a lot in Star Trek. It's in front of us. It's beside us. It's underneath us. We can't get away, Captain. So that was fun. And then whether it was just limitations of the budget at the time, even with the new enhanced digital effects, at the end of the day, the Deus Ex Machina that UrzaMaster refers to are a pair of green blobs. It's almost like, we blew our budget on the medieval costume and the fortress set and so forth. They're green blobs and they talk, and that's basically all we're going to get there. So that is where we. What's that?
The first time I saw this episode, I was little, and my grandma was I don't know. She was walking around, so I'm watching the episode, and I go, "Grandma, look, Liberace is on Star Trek." And I remember saying that because he looked like I thought it was Liberace, and my grandma's like, "That's not Liberace." So I had to bring that up,
right? And the thing about him is that, like, the greatest crime to him, it's not that you, like, threaten his life or anything. It's like that you have ill manners. I mean, which, again, the whole back and forth with him and Spock, and they give Spock some great lines. I don't respect, power without discipline, or intelligence without discipline, or however he puts him down. It's a terrific moment, actually, and there's some real genuine, like, disdain, right? Contempt even. For both, Spock's just kind of like, so that was very good. All right, well, we move on from the Squire of Gothos to Star Trek Arena, which aired a week later on January 19th, 1967. Director was once again Joseph Pevney, and Joseph Pevney actually, this is not the first episode we've seen with him. He actually was tied with director Mark Daniels for the most original series episodes directed. So they both directed 14 of them in their careers. It was a tie.
Wow.
And we've already seen Pevney several times before, and no need to go back and redo it. Although he did, I remember off the top of my head, he did do Miri because his kids were part of those rascally band of scamps, lovable scamps that were on the planet avoiding the plague. So director was Joe Pevney, so a Star Trek veteran by this point in the season. And this is, to our knowledge, the only Star Trek episode, in fact, probably through any continuum or generation, that was actually based on outside source material. Arena originally was a short story by noted science fiction author Frederick Brown. And what happened was the new showrunner and unofficial behind-the-scenes rewriter, the one who got Gene Roddenberry in hot water by not following the memos on shore leave and making it even crazier. And then Gene had to sit outside with a typewriter and furiously rewrite the thing. Gene L. Kuhn, whose name you're going to be seeing a lot of now from here on through the rest of Star Trek's original run, he did the script. And what happened was he came up and he wrote Arena. By all accounts, he wasn't plagiarizing. He wrote this story, and one of the lawyers over at NBC or Desilu said, "Wait a minute, this sounds familiar." And it turns out that he had been influenced, subconsciously or otherwise, by this short story, Arena, by Frederick Brown. So they actually had to go and buy the rights for the story to be able to do the episode. And they do that all the time. And I mean, in Hollywood, you see adaptations of Michael Connelly and James Patterson and Tom Clancy. I mean, that's what you do on the feature side and so forth, or if you're adapting a book for a miniseries. But this is the first time, and I believe the only time, that Star Trek had to go out and pay the author an undisclosed amount in order to skirt any lawsuits or threats of lawsuits. So the writing credit on this episode will say story by Frederick Brown, script by Gene L. Kuhn. And then so that's how this one came to be there. It also features, we just saw this in Shore Leave, Vasquez Rocks, which again is only about 15 minutes down the road from where I am currently stationed. Someday I'll go out and record something at Vasquez Rocks so you guys can see.
That would be fantastic.
A couple of double axe handles.
How many times that they would just go out to that location and spin the camera around another 90 degrees and say, "All right, and go." So that's there. And that's going to be one of my quibbles with this episode, which we'll get into shortly, about their use of Vasquez Rocks, but we'll get there in a moment. The Gorn's voice, when it does speak, and I don't believe we've had any speaking Gorn yet in Strange New Worlds, it was Ted Cassidy. Now, as an actor, Ted Cassidy played Ruck, the android in What Little Girls Are Made Of, kind of the creepy android who was that they encountered on that planet. He was also the voice of Baylock, the scary voice of Baylock, before Clint Howard reveals himself to be just a delightful child who wanted to show everybody around his ship. So Ted Cassidy, he's done voice work, he's done on-camera work, so he's a Star Trek vet here. The beginning of this, which is fantastic, in fact, it's my favorite part of the episode, ironically, is with no Gorn on camera or anything of that nature. It's when they're laying under siege at the Celsius starbase outpost, and they're basically under heavy mortar fire and shelling. But it came at a price. Both William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy were standing too close to one of the explosions, and although those are, a high degree of safety is involved in Hollywood productions, Alec Baldwin westerns notwithstanding, they were too close, and they both developed tinnitus in opposing ears. So for the rest of their lives following that, they would have these reoccurring bouts of tinnitus. For William Shatner, it was his left ear, and for Leonard Nimoy, it was his right ear. And so knowing this, I tried to spot the moment in the episode, if they had kept it close, when one of those squibs had gone off that could have conceivably been the one that did it. And there were a couple of brief possibilities, but nothing definitive. But whatever it was, it did provide some hearing loss that would go on, not just for this, but throughout their career there. So And that's where I'll start, is because the unseen enemy, the explosions and the fire they're taking, and Kirk and Spock running through open territory, zigging, then zagging, then zigging again to try and avoid this and figure it out. Just absolutely draws you into this episode. It sets the stakes ridiculously high. It's got great production value in the sense that we're blowing stuff up, and then we have the correct usage of photon torpedoes. As before in Balance of Terror, what they were referring to as phasers was actually the photon torpedoes. Well, they fixed that, and I mean the chasing of the Gorn ship, the very echoes of the vibe Strange New Worlds was giving us, of the Gorn sort of leaping into a system, causing havoc, and then the pursuit of and chase of, coupled with Kirk's determination early on for vengeance, like fly the ship faster, fly her apart if you have to, but we're going to bring them to justice, even as Spock and the others try to counsel a more humane, logical approach to it, and he won't have any of it. And it's an interesting thing I want you guys to contextualize within Kirk's character, perhaps, because it always feels like sometimes he'll find a red line and slightly step over it. He won't, leap fully out of character, but it always feels like sometimes he'll just edge right up to it and maybe poke a toe or two over, and then come to his realization. No, a good Starfleet captain would not do that, and that's where we find ourselves at the end of the episode. The thing that I had with the episode, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, it was shot in 67, 66 when they actually went in the cameras, and you have a guy in a suit, right? I mean, the Gorn is not going to look as cool as he does in Strange New Worlds as a digital xenomorph, state-of-the-art special effect. And I'm willing to completely forgive that, right? That is not what bothers me if I have a quibble or a tribble about this episode. It's not the Gorn and the fact that it looks like something you'd see in a Japanese Toho film, of the late 60s. It's just that, for me, like, the first almost half of this episode is so gripping and so tense and so exciting that a little bit of the air for the balloon comes down when it becomes more of a mano a mano. And that's where we get back to the Vasquez Rocks pursuit, because I feel like literally we just saw this a couple of episodes ago in Shore Leave with Finnegan and Kirk, and that fight scene which rivals Rowdy Piper and Keith David's epic clash in John Carpenter's They Live. I mean, that fight scene took 8 to 10 minutes of screen time, and we commented on it like, wow, this thing, they threw everything but the kitchen sink in there. And once again, it's just kind of like the direction, at least as it kind of before, it does pick up when Kirk discovers, gunpowder and does a Bill Nye Science Guy, thing to be able to eventually take the Gorn down. I mean, that's very clever and intuitive and smart. That's what you want your Star Trek to be. But I just felt like sometimes getting there, it's just the directions were just like, all right, climb up there, Shatner. All right. And then, scramble down over here. Like, I feel like sometimes the location can lull you, and so you get a little flabby because you're just showing shots of running around the rocks and the different crevices, and I'll take cover here, and then I don't know, for me, some of that tension didn't quite sustain. And then, like I say, I mean, like a roller coaster, it kind of comes down into a little low and a little valley, and then picks back up as we get, near the climax and the revelation. And then the climax for me, that the Greek god, that they show, it says, oh, you were in Kansas all along, and the Gorn is fine, and we'll let you go, and we'll catch up with your species in a few hundred years. You're on the right path. I don't know, coming so soon after Trelane, literally the next episode that was aired, I've had my fill at this moment of gods who just step in and use the Enterprise as playthings, And, like I say, because we've had Conscience of the King and we've had Dagger of the Mind and we've had some great one-on-ones. We're going to be getting, spoiler alert, Space Seed coming, later down the channel. So I'd like to see more of that human, the human condition, the human adventure, not so much the God interference. But overall, the idea that, okay, you guys are fighting and you're disturbing our rest, so we're going to put you on a planet and you two duke it out. That's Arena, right? That's the premise of the episode. So that ultimately is what sinks or swims. But like I say, you guys can agree to disagree, but I thought those first 20 minutes were just so gripping. I mean, I thought we were watching Balance of Terror again. And then we just kind of, like I say, we just kind of come back down to earth. And then, Kirk uses ingenuity. And that's great, right? He doesn't like, oh, I just found a phaser and I'm going to shoot it. Like, he has to think his way out of it, as the crew watches in the CCTV, like, do it, you can do it, Jim, come on. And they're like, Spock, what are you talking about? No, he's got it. I love that, the cheering on of Kirk. But, gentlemen, I leave it to you and the Gorn.
It's interesting, right? Because it's the menagerie in reverse. You know what I mean? Like, you get sort of the tense part of the menagerie, but it's really kind of better in that first, shall we say, half of the episode. And then you kind of get the back half of the menagerie where you're sort of just like watching on CCTV what's actually happening. It didn't feel like a letdown for me. It just felt like two different episodes that got mashed together. Like they had a real gripping sort of almost modern like type episode where the Enterprise is actually like at war. They're not just exploring; they're in a fight with an enemy, and it's greater than just one ship. It's affecting a colony, which I think later Star Trek episodes and other series do really well. But then you get it brought back down to the microcosm level, where it's like, well, this is really about Kirk and Kirk being representative of the best of humanity kind of thing. And it's not bad. Like, I think it's just, it's telling the same story, but in two different ways, and it feels a little jarring in the episode. What I do like about it, though, is it introduces the idea of a translator for languages that are not so immediately translated, right? And that's interesting to me because, later on we get the idea of the universal translator and stuff in later series. But this is kind of the first time they acknowledge that there's a literal language barrier between these two species. They can't understand each other. And they don't understand each other's motivations from the jump of the episode, but by the end of the episode, they sort of get it. Like, oh, okay, we really were infringing on your territory and you were defending yourselves, and maybe there is this innocent explanation that resulted in accidental bloodshed, and that's a growth moment for human and like identity, I think. And that's really what stuck out to me more in this episode than the, all right, we're going to have Kirk run around and find diamonds and be like, oh, boy, sure would like to have some of these diamonds, but oh well. And then he just tosses them on the ground. Like, you're not going to grab like a few of those just for shits and giggles? Like, or it's the hardest substance known to man, but I'm not going to put it in my canon. I'm going to use just rocks. Like, yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of that, but at the same time, it's like it's testing the human ingenuity. It's testing just like human compassion, where the Gorn are clearly lacking. The Gorn are dead set on, killing and more instinctual defense and stuff like that, which is intriguing. I mean, to say the least, in terms of like the overall messaging of the episode, I think that's the strength of this. Whereas I think the storytelling itself is a little flawed. I think it achieves its goal sort of on accident. And it is. It's foundational to Star Trek, right? It's Captain. Well, I mean, they do it in many other episodes. It's Captain marooned from crew having to deal with some situation where even though they can communicate, can they really understand each other? Well, you get the vice versa next gen, right? With Darmok and Jalad. You know, it's they can't communicate, but they sort of understand each other, and they, you know, eventually learn to communicate and understand each other. But does it in the end make any difference? No, it doesn't. They're kind of in the same space, but they're closer, and that's. I mean, it's definitely a retelling of the same episode, but it's so unique and different, and the way in which they get their messages across, it just feels inspiring. Like, you know, it's one of those Trek episodes that isn't necessarily like gonna win any awards, but it's an examination that I think has to happen. Like, every Star Trek series has to have their version of Arena to kind of legitimize themselves in the canon of things. And it's, again, a very Roddenberry, self-reflective human episode. Even though he didn't directly write it, like, this is sort of his vision of, like, we have to be introspective on both a macro and a micro level. And your macro is the colony being attacked. Your micro is the captain mano a mano. And that, to me, honestly, I think it almost kind of overrides kind of some of the hokey stuff that we get in this episode. Like, oh, basic chemistry, Dr. McCoy. Why wouldn't Dr. McCoy have, like, basic chemistry at the forefront of his mind as, I don't know, the chief medical officer? But it's interesting just because of the setup, you know. And yeah, we get a lot of godlike creatures, and it's, I have to say, by the end of this season, it will feel pretty tired. But remember that in 66, 67, none of these stories had ever been told, and nobody's seeing this episode twice. So for us, yeah, it's very easy to be like, ugh, again? But week in, week out, you'd be surprised how many details you forget when you've only seen something once. So nobody is tired by the end of this season of these godlike being stories. They're like, wow, this spaceship and its captain are really getting in all these like sticky situations, and like it's always intriguing, it's always gripping, it's always entertaining, and that's it, really. I mean, nobody is contesting this week in, week out, and that's why they kind of get away with so much repetition. But I think that's also why future Star Trek works that much better, because they sort of start to respect and recognize that syndication is going to be retelling these stories, and people are going to come back and sort of have, you know, more information as they go forward. So we have to get deeper and more creative. And instead of just telling the captain's story, we have to tell the crew's story. And that's where you get a new and next generation. And I don't know. I think Arena is that first time that we kind of get a sample of what future Star Trek could and does do.
The guy that played the Gorn should have been Cobra Commander in all the cartoons, with the way he's at the end of every sentence. But well, I think with the God thing, it was maybe during that time period, or for those writers, it was an easy way to get out of something, right? Well, it was these uber-powered beings who set all this up. There's no way we would just beam down to a planet and fight each other one-on-one. So I think all those episodes, too, it just became something easy to do. That's kind of how I felt about the Borg for a while. Like, the Borg was an easy plot device that you could plug in to Voyager or Next Gen or whatever you needed to do, you could plug that in somewhere. And that kind of seemed to be the case for these uber-powered beings to just show up, and that's why all those things were happening. I also like how slow the Gorn was when he would swing, and he would do that. So I'm really looking forward to. So here's a question for the two of you: how are they going to resolve this in Strange New Worlds, or are they going to resolve it, or are we just going to live with the reset? So is it a reset that they're doing with the Gorn, or do you think they're going to go back to this idea that maybe it's the older they get, they get more, they even get stronger, but they're slower? I don't know. Where do you think they're going with this?
I will answer your question with my own question, which is, do we think the Strange New World staff by the end of this episode, as we say, there's the ambiguity of, well, you intruded on our territory, we were defending ourselves, versus you slaughtered innocent Starfleet civilians in a colony. And it's sort of like, all right, we agree to disagree, and we'll try and stay out of each other's way in the future. I mean, that's how they resolve it here, lickety split. The Strange New World creators obviously wanted to deepen the Gorn relationship, and we have hints of that in the season finale, when they're talking about solar flares may be causing some of the aggression. And so my question was, have the Gorn's actions in Strange New World crossed a line that you can't come back from, in the sense that you could say, well, you were just acting to preserve your species, and we were in places we weren't supposed to be necessarily. I mean, I'm just wondering if they're going to resolve it with a original series explanation, or if they'll say, no, there are consequences to this, and I mean, maybe they've killed or done too much to be forgiven, I guess. Do you forgive the Gorn? I mean, and I think that would be a fascinating thing that they play out. Or are they just now sworn adversaries, like the Klingons and the Romulans and everything at time? I don't know. Can we forgive Gorn, UrzaMaster?
Well,
Uther?
it just now I'm trying to figure out, because in this episode I feel like we were acting like we had never encountered the Gorn before, but that's not the case. So again, is this a reset? Because theoretically, Spock, Uhura, right? They should all know about the Gorn.
Yeah, and I don't think it necessarily was that they didn't know about them. I think they just weren't fully understanding of their tactics, and then of course the godlike creature stepped in. And I think that's something that, because we haven't seen it necessarily on Strange New Worlds yet, that's probably their out, is that they're going to have this escalation of conflict and put Pike and the crew through a lot of this, and there will probably be some type of resolution like that. I think it's going to tie more into the solar flare activity, and there's going to be some kind of an understanding and a negotiation and a speech from Captain Pike. And I don't think any of that's going to feel tired or convenient necessarily. But I think that's where a caretaking kind of, shall we say, otherworldly being may step in and provide kind of that, here's a way for you two to understand each other. You may not be friends after this, but now you have your Darmok and Jalad moment. And I think that's probably how you resolve that best. You're going to still get decisive action from Pike. You're still going to get all that good stuff from the crew. And there's still going to be hurt feelings. Nobody's going to feel great about it. And that's where the tension remains, and you can still have Arena happen, quote unquote, afterwards. But you also can breed some understanding and some possibility that'll eventually loop you back to Arena. I also think that's where Strange New Worlds has to go. Like, they have to start encountering some of these godlike beings, whether it's a Trelane or, it can't be Trelane because then Spock would have known. But, a similar type entity. Could even be Q, honestly. I think there's no reason why they couldn't, right? I suffice to say, I'm looking forward to it. But I think that's probably, a lot's been said about Arena, but I think one thing we haven't said, and we haven't said of the Squire of Gothos either, is how many warp cores are we given these episodes? Now we've got two of probably the longest standing, most influential episodes of Star Trek the original series. So I'll start there. Dr. Sam Loomis, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think Squire of Gothos, for what you say it represents, that foundation, and knowing that further iterations of the show will explore the omnipotent beings, I think it's a solid 6 for me. Again, a couple of little moments aside there. I think we get I think we get one of the best representations of that type of an episode where the Enterprise is forced to indulge the whims of a godlike being that is not quite fully matured. I think this is probably as good an expression of that theme as one could want. So I'll go with a 6 on that one. I'm not prepared to dismiss Arena out of hand and give it a lower warp core than it deserves, but I'm also not prepared to elevate it to some of the Balance of Terror episodes we've talked about, and Dagger of the Mind and The Conscience of the King and so forth. I don't think it quite reaches those heights for me, so I'm gonna go 5.5 because I don't think it deserves a 5 or lower, but I also don't think it deserves anything above or anything 6 or higher. So I feel like 5.5 lands for me. I would have loved to have seen it as a child in that era in '67, even if it means I'm older now, because I think in the right age, if I had been 4 or 5, pre-Star Wars, the Gorn might have terrified me, much like the space vampire and Buck Rogers in the 25th century. Like, it might have just been one of those indelible childhood moments where it's like, and I'm sure a lot of people, as special effects were back then, they probably were creeped out again by this green thing with the teeth and the disco ball eyes. And I mean, that could have very easily left a mark. So I wish I could travel back to my younger self and experience it like that and then have a different perspective on it. But like I said, the design of the Gorn is not what sort of ultimately left me a little bit feeling wanting here. So I go 5.5 on that one. It's good. It could have been great. And I love UrzaMaster's idea of sort of a Frankenstein, for the Halloween references, a Frankenstein's stitched script of attack on colony, one-on-one. I like the idea that they kind of stitch these disparate sources together, perhaps.
Oh, me? Yes. I'm just kidding. Squire Gothos, 6 out of 7. I think it's a great setup for future, again, like we're saying, right? Great setup for future Trek. And again, Urza, excellent points as always, which is why everyone always clicks subscribe to join all the hundreds and thousands and eventually millions of fans. So make sure you click that subscribe button so you can get more of Urza's thoughts. But, viewing it then, I agree with you. You might not see the constant, like I said, the escape hatch, I guess, of using godlike beings. So I think that's why I'm giving a 6 out of 7, because I just feel like it was very convenient. Arena, I'm gonna go 5 out of 7 because I agree with Dr. Luminite's point about it just seems almost like 2 different episodes in a sense. They were just kind of put together. So I think 5 out of 7 there, even though, when I was younger, the rubbery feet of that Gorn did scare me. But again, Kirk always outwits his opponents, so that's why he's one of the greatest ever. So Dr. Loomis, I agree with you 100%. I'm going to go 6 out of 7 or 5 out of 7 there.
Right on. It's tough because I want to rate the Squire of Gothos on its own merits, but I think there's this impossible tie to my favorite Q continuum, and I can't ignore it. I don't think it's a 7 out of 7. I'm going to go 6 out of 7. I think the only reason it doesn't quite hit that pinnacle is it lacks the menace to really feel like anybody's in any real danger. But that's also kind of the beauty of it, is it always feels kind of childlike and childish.
Playful. Yeah.
Where I think Encounter at Farpoint, which we'll talk in a later episode when we get to Next Gen, you do get that menace. You do get that feeling like, ooh, and that's where Next Generation really gripped its audience, I think, and grabbed you by the haunches and wouldn't let you go. But I feel like it had so much good going on for itself in what it was, and the playful nature of Trelane, but also kind of the adolescence of it. I just really respect this episode. So 6 out of 7 there for Warp Core rating. Arena as a foil, I think, was less successful, and I think it's going to be the episode that follows it up that is why I think it's less successful, because you get a little bit better story of war. But I love what they were doing in the beginning of this. I loved the idea of being on site at a colony. I think I'm also colored a bit by the Strange New Worlds finale that did it better. However, Darmok and Jalad is my favorite Next Gen episode, probably, outside of the Q episodes. And this being the original version of that story, it gives me kind of those nostalgia feelings that I can't deny elevates what is otherwise kind of a cheesy episode. And the slow motion fighting and all the double axe handles, and I mean, even in the day, I feel like it was kind of like, what? Why is he moving so slow? And like, if he's that powerful, how is Kirk just fighting back and not having his back broken in half with that double axe handle? Like, that's, I don't want to hate on it because it feels like I'm very modern lens. Whereas, yeah, when I was younger and I saw this the first time, I was terrified by the Gorn. Like, that was a big, scary rubber helmet. It's still kind of scary because now I think about, geez, how do you breathe in that thing? It must have been like 90 degrees in there the whole time. Because that was absolutely like heavy rubber. That was not the light materials of Hollywood today. That was asbestos rubber, and probably, cocaine glue or something. Like, it was rough, I'm sure, for that actor behind the mask. And now they've done so much with it. I think of the Star Trek video game commercial where it was William Shatner and the Gorn costume, and they were playing the Star Trek video game together. And I was just thinking to myself the other day, like, gosh, they kind of get that it's cheesy, but it's still kind of cool. Like, in some ways, like, as much as I want to hate on it, like, I'm like, it's still damn cool. Like, the whole I'm going to remember chemistry, and you think of like basic chemistry, right? In the far-flung future of Star Trek, remembering something as basic as gunpowder is just as hard as some of us remembering the very basic concepts of like long division. How often are you doing long division in your head? Probably never. You're rounding all the time. You're like, well, it's about 3. So I'm going to, making my recipe, I'm going to use about 3 cups of sugar, whatever. And you just kind of fudge it. Because, sorry, mathematicians and my former math teachers who are probably watching this, you can pretty much fudge anything, and eventually it's going to be just about right. Whether you're building a house, building a bridge, if it's close, close counts. Even the space shuttle, close counts. And that's how you get things like the Challenger. But the truth, never too soon. The truth is, I think 5.5 is a very appropriate rating. 5 and a little fudge room, right? And by the way, rest in peace to those who died on the Challenger. I'm not trying to make light. It was a horrible tragedy. But the truth be told is, in the future of Star Trek, everything can be a little fudged. That was definitely not exact measurements on how to make gunpowder, but it worked. So improvisation, in as much as science is a very particular thing, it is also an art. So that, I think, is the overarching message here, not the, hey, there was an explosion in the 80s. Forget that part. Improvisation Improvisation. That's how the Apollo 13 came back to Earth. Tom Hanks. So,
Great save for you and Apollo 13, without a doubt.
Yes.
So nice job there.
yep, and that's
Thank
why
you,
Tom
Ed.
Hanks won the award.
Thank
Which
you,
is why
Edgar.
everyone subscribes to us anyway. So there we go.
Yeah. See, now you have to watch the whole podcast.
Sound logic like that makes everyone click the subscribe button. And if you want to hear more, keep saying it. Just click that button down below.
That's why you can't.
Urza's thoughts.
You can't miss a minute of the Warp Core podcast. And in 37 episodes, how many times do we bring up, horrible tragedies? This is the first time, probably. Or
And probably the last. You never know.
you'll never know, because I'm great with the metaphors. I am known for them. You can ask anybody who went to college with me. Some of my metaphors are legend. I think of walking fast like a dead guy being one of them. So, thank you for 37 episodes. Next time, Lord Uther and Dr. Sam Loomis will be flying solos. I have been fired. I'm just kidding. But definitely we look forward to exploring more Star Trek with all of you as we venture to strange new worlds, strange new metaphors, and the far beyond. And as always, live long and prosper.